today's class meeting is just getting into an introduction of linguistic determinism. So the kind of three key words that we want to talk about before we discuss the reading homework is linguistic determinism, linguistic relativism, and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So linguistic determinism is sort of the bolder and stronger and more rigid stance of our topic for today. And it just basically holds that the logical structures of a specific language, so that would be like the grammar rules, the syntax rules, just sort of like the rules and conventions for how you make sense through language. That type of logic and reasoning determines the things in the world that you are able to perceive. It determines the inferences that you are able to make from those perceptions. And then it determines the assumptions, the implications, the values, the logic, the morality. Basically, the rules of language determine every other thought process that you could possibly have. So that's linguistic determinism. And you can remember that that's the bold one because the word determinism is like it's the rules of language and the logic of language determines the way that you're able to perceive and think about and come to conclusions about the world around you. The second kind of key word that we want to talk about is linguistic relativism, and that one is a more lenient, more flexible version of linguistic determinism. And these days, linguistic determinism is not widely accepted by scholars, whereas linguistic relativism is. So linguistic relativism is basically saying the same overall idea that language and its logic and its structures influence the way that you see the world around you, the way that you come to conclusions about the things that you see, and the way that you sort of synthesize your conclusions into values, morality, and logic, ethics, things like that. So linguistic relativism allows more flexibility because it's not saying that all of your thoughts and all of your ideas are determined by language, therefore radically different between groups of different speakers, but it is just relative. So some languages might influence you to observe things differently or to value things differently. So linguistic determinism is that hardcore, rigid one that is no longer accepted by scholars, whereas linguistic relativism is the more lenient view. And that brings us to our third key word that we want to talk about before we introduce the reading assignments, and that word is Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So the theory of linguistic relativism actually, I guess, isn't a theory to begin with because it is a hypothesis. I'm not super well up to date on my scientific vocabulary, but I'm pretty sure that theory is once a hypothesis has been proven over and over and over again. So with language data, experiments aren't always like repeatable and verifiable the way that scientific data often is. But the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the sort of language discipline's technical jargon for the theory of linguistic relativism. And as you might be able to guess from our announcement and from the assignments that are linked in the module, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf are the two people who came up with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. They didn't work together very much. They weren't really partners in the professional sense, but they did have a little bit of interaction with each other. Edward Sapir is a professional linguist by trade, like that's his profession, or was. And the article that we're reading was written in 1929, so it's been a while. I don't even know if he's still alive. Probably not. I'll delete that part. Jesus, what was I saying? Okay. Edward Sapir was a linguist by profession. So that was his job. So he studied in the field, he taught in the field, he wrote in the field of linguistics. Yeah, linguistics. So he once had a student whose name was Benjamin Whorf, and Benjamin Whorf was more in the engineering field. He was more into practical, hands-on disciplines rather than scholarship. So he didn't really ever get fully situated into the field of linguistics, but he did do work in that field. Like he did projects where he analyzed the different language habits of different Native American groups. But he didn't make that his sort of home, so to speak, in his professional life. So Benjamin Whorf was a one-time student of Edward Sapir, and he was really influenced by this idea of linguistic relativism. So he did some other things, some other studies, and about 20 years after Edward Sapir's text was published, Benjamin Whorf wrote a text, like in the 1940s. He wrote a text on the same topic, but it was never published until he died, I believe. Maybe we'll look that up. But his text sort of takes a different look at the same topic that was initially brought up by Edward Sapir. All right, so now that we have a little bit of an understanding about these three keywords, linguistic determinism, linguistic relativism, and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, let's go over to the introductory videos where we can see an overview of both of those texts. In order to begin that activity, you will first need to print out both texts, and you'll need a highlighter to highlight along as we overview some of the main points of their argument. See you there.